I'll have another video talking about panel transitions in the coming weeks, so keep an eye out for that.
So let's talk about those. In Scott McCloud's book, Making Comics, there are 6 panel transitions that he describes. They are moment to moment, action to action, scene to scene, aspect to aspect, non-sequiturs, and subject to subject. Before we dive into the first transition, please transition your mouse over to the subscribe button and click. Now, onto the first one. The moment-to-moment panels are the tiny little changes that occur between each panel. They work in a similar way that you would imagine an animation frame. A common example is if you wanted to show an eye blink, you would start the first panel with an eye open, and then the second panel with the eye closed, and the third panel with the eye open again. That's 3 moment-to-moment panels. If you wanted to show one object getting closer to another object, then you may use moment-to-moments for that as well. The same applies for our point of view. If the camera is getting closer and closer in each panel, then these are moment-to-moments too. This is by far the most common panel transition, and Scott McCloud took samples from various comics to help illustrate this in his book Understanding Comics. These are similar to moment, but there's more space in between the panels. In this scene taken from my comic The Ripple Effect, we see action-to-action panel transitions. We've got our character vomiting, wiping his mouth, and exiting the room. Action to action doesn't necessarily mean action like in a fight scene. The actions can be mundane, like making a cup of coffee or vomiting in a 17th century toilet. Normal stuff. Subject to subject transitions are changes from one subject to another in any given scene. The most common example of this would be if 2 characters are talking and the panels are switching from one character to the next. This isn't limited to just characters talking, because during that particular conversation, the subject could change from a character to the door as the doorbell's being rung. That would be a subject to subject transition. And usually these transitions are all involved in the same scene. Which brings us onto this one. Scene to scene works in the same way as subject to subject, except instead of a subject, you're moving from one location to another. If you've read a comic, which I assume you have, then you may have seen that when a panel depicts an entirely new scene, it will often be accompanied with some lettering to help contextualize that scene. Meanwhile, later that day or 5 years later are all useful indicators to help the reader know that they've gone from one scene to the next and how they relate to each other. The aspect to aspect transitions show us different areas of the scene, and they can help provide information or set the mood. You may start with what's on the table and transition to what a character is holding, and then transition to that character sitting at that table. These are all different aspects and can help set the scene. The non-sequitur, as the title suggests, are where 2 panels are shown that have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. For the most part, you'll probably want to avoid these unless you're confident that the reader can keep up and can understand what you're trying to say. There's no exact science to this, and the variety and number of panel transitions you use is up to you, and it's whatever you feel best fits the story. But the 3 most common ones, particularly in Western comics, are the action-to-action, subject-to-subject, and scene-to-scene transitions. Just using these 3 transitions alone can really help tell incredibly compelling stories. You don't need to overcomplicate it. The main reason that you don't see that many moment-to-moment transitions is because action-to-action is simply more efficient. You could panel out the individual limbs of someone moving from one panel to the next and create an entire page of just someone walking. Or you could have one panel of them walking to a location and the second panel of them getting to that location. So it's 9 panels versus 2, and you're achieving basically the same thing. And this is kind of the reason why aspect-to-aspect transitions aren't used as much in Western comics as they are in comics like manga. And that's because in the West we tend to like our pacing to be a bit faster. The next time you read manga or even watch an anime show compared to an American cartoon, you'll notice that the pacing is usually slower, and certain scenes in anime are allowed to breathe a bit more. And likewise with manga, you'll notice that there are more aspect-to-aspect transitions. The non-sequitur is just weird, and you should probably avoid it, especially if this is your first comic. If you can pull off a non-sequitur, then more power to you. Now, if you buy Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, he'll explain much more the differences in culture between the West and the East when it comes to comics and manga and the different transitions used. So again, I definitely recommend picking that up. You need to have a bit of trust and faith in your reader when you're planning out the transitions that you want to use between the panels, and how much you want to risk on faith is up to you. One reader might understand or even appreciate an aspect-to-aspect transition, whereas another reader might get bored by it. Some transitions may be confusing to some readers and inspired by others. So checking with friends and colleagues is pretty helpful for this reason. This is also why it's really important to understand who your audience is before you start creating. An older audience will tend to have a bit more patience and will allow a scene to breathe and to take its time, whereas a younger audience might want to get to the fireworks factory a lot quicker. Whichever transition you choose, just make sure it serves your story. I've been Brinkley, have fun drawing, and I'll see you in the next one.